Hi, today's video I'm going to be talking about Gen Z problems again. I've made a couple of videos like this before, talking about different Gen Z struggles, rising rates of anxiety and depression, Gen Z and millennials no longer choosing to have kids, and today I kind of wanted to do another similar video about how Gen Z really got fucked over. This video is a little bit sad, but this is the kind of thing that I like to talk about. So I'm kind of going to break it into a few different sections of school, working life, relationships, and some other outside sources. And also I want to mention some coping mechanisms that previous generations used to use to feel better about certain life struggles that Gen Z is not using and why. The first card in the deck that is shuffled against Gen Z is definitely regards to school. A lot of Gen Z right now is either in high school or in college. Their school years coming up to graduating, I think, were in some ways similar to older generations and in some ways different. I saw some studies where Gen Z legitimately feels more stressed out at school because of school shooting worries and being scared of that being a possibility. And school shootings have risen way up in recent years while Gen Z has been at school. So it's not like that fear is completely based on nothing. I mean, it's based on the fact that school shootings have become more common, and it's definitely hard to enjoy school when you're stressed out about something like that, as well as being stressed about just the normal schoolwork, which past generations have had to deal with. But I think the even harder problem becomes at the end of high school, where a fair amount of Gen Z is right now, and going on to higher education. This is really unfortunate because college used to be affordable and it wasn't expected. Now it's completely unaffordable and is also extremely expected. It's like the worst way it could have flip-flopped, because back when you could go, no one really felt like they needed to. Some people did, but it was not as much pressure as it is now. Now you have to go for so many different jobs or you won't even be considered, and no one can afford it. Student debt is like in the trillions. I am going to link some of the articles that I read that made me think about making this video in the description, but there's one calculation, I guess, that people have done to adjust for inflation and see how much you would have had to work a minimum wage job back in the 80s to pay for 1 year of college. And you could have paid for it by working, I believe, like 1,300 hours, and that would have paid for a year of college back in the 80s. 1,300 hours. And yes, it's on minimum wage, but if minimum wage jobs aren't for working college students and high school students, then I don't know who boomers think those jobs are for. I actually think that $7.25 is the current minimum wage, but this particular calculation said, let's assume you could get a job for $9 an hour in college. You'd have to work 2,400 hours to pay for 1 year again. So the amount you've had to work to pay for a year of college now is, that amount doesn't add up. Like, you would have to have a full-time job and a part-time job while going to school and working full-time and part-time in the summers. There's like literally not enough hours in a day, a week, a month to be able to work through school and cover it. So it's basically a guarantee that you're going into debt unless you are able to get a scholarship or some other form of grant, or you're lucky because you're privileged and your family has money. if you didn't draw any of those cards, you are signing up to begin your adult life with thousands of dollars of debt. And that's like, it really begins your adult life in a shit way, because you're going off to college, which should be like a fun, exciting time to learn about who you are and what you would like to do with your life. And you're doing that, but with debt. And that did not used to be the case for previous generations. And it is now for Gen Z and for millennials. So part of the reason that student debt is such a big problem, and this leads me to my next point about the workforce, and once you've graduated college with all of your debt and entering into the workforce, cost of living has risen, which is normal, that happens, but wages have been completely stagnant, honestly, since like the 80s and maybe even the 70s. Wages have not risen like cost of living has. So we're getting paid the same and things cost more, and you have debt. How is Gen Z supposed to afford things that their previous generation could afford? And it's interesting because income as a whole has risen a lot, but only for the top 1%. Back in the 70s, the top 1% was accounting for 9% of all income in America, and now the top 1% accounts for 23% of all income. So wages are rising, but only for the people at the very top of the ladder, which is ridiculous and awful, but aside from that, you can't expect to be coming into the workforce as a freshly graduated college Gen Z person and have any chance of making an amazing living wage, because even if you get a great job that pays well, you have your debt to pay off. You're starting like in the negatives. It's so stacked against them. Oh yeah, I had another statistic that I wanted to mention that regard to the workforce, things actually have gotten worse for the majority of people when it comes to wages and being able to afford things. And these numbers have been adjusted for inflation, but in the late 70s, the average male worker had an income of $48,300. And in 2010, that number has actually gone down to 33,000. The average male worker is making less than they used to in the late 70s. The only people whose wages have been able to increase to match up plenty with the cost of living rising has been the people at the top of the ladder, the CEOs, people like that, where their wages in the late 70s used to be close to 400,000 and now it's 1.1 million. So income has only risen for just the smallest slice of people. Most people are never going to be in the 1%, and Gen Z is just starting with so many things against them. Previous generations did not have these things working against them. They weren't beginning their lives in thousands of dollars of debt. They had a chance of wages that could, you know how like all of our grandparents were able to go to school and then purchase a house? That it's millennials and Gen Z, it's not that we don't want homes. We just literally cannot afford them. I don't know why older generations look at us and say that we're lazy. That's not the case. It's just that things are more expensive than they used to be, and wages have not risen to compensate for that. So we quite literally cannot buy homes, which is another problem with trying to build wealth. You can't build any assets because things like a house, which is most people's largest asset, Gen Z has no chance of buying that in their 20s because their wages won't allow that to happen. So I want to move on from school and work and talk about relationships. This is another area that Gen Z is really struggling with and having a hard time. They kind of have been screwed over. Technology, I think, is a huge part of why relationships have become fewer and less close over the years. I know there have been some studies of how many friends the average person had like 20, 30 years ago and how many friends someone has now, and it has gone down. And maybe the amount of people you know and acquaintances has gone up due to social media and technology being able to expand your circle to people you wouldn't ordinarily know. But the number of close friends that people has gone down. Technology is a good way to communicate with family and friends and maintain communication and contact with them, but it isn't doing a lot for building close relationships. And I think there is just something to be said that an in-person hanging out with or talking to someone just can't be replaced by like speaking over Instagram DMs. And it's difficult because if you avoid technology and social media, then you're really signing up to make yourself an outcast and have it hard to make friends or close relationships because people expect you to be available on those platforms and through technology now. Another part of this that has been really hard, and you can't avoid it, is seeing people who you don't know who are putting on these amazing lives and looking like they're doing so well. Previous generations did not have to deal with that nearly as much as Gen Z is. Like, it was just the popular girl in your school who was very cool and seemed a lot better than you, but she still went to your school. Like, there was some part of her that was still a little bit relatable. And now, seeing certain people on social media has just blown that out of the water, and it's easy to feel shit about yourself when there are so many people just presenting themselves to you. You don't even have to look for it. They just appear the moment you pick up your phone and enter your life and wave around how great their life is compared to yours. And even if it's not real, you still see it and it still goes into your head and it feels a little bit real. It's so difficult to have a good relationship with yourself with the amount of comparison. And it's like in previous years, maybe you compared yourself to like the cool people at your school or at your work and celebrities. Those things are still the case. And now you have added on influencers and people you don't really know on social media. So it's just piling on top of each other to hurt your relationship with yourself and with other people. Just have that level of slight removal and distance because of technology and social media. And much like I mentioned how starting out your adult life with debt from student loans, it's a really pivotal time in a lot of people's lives, graduating from college and entering the workforce. You're not reporting to anyone anymore. It's just yourself, and you're responsible for yourself. So starting it out with debt is definitely a way that Gen Z is being fucked over. But also, there are a couple of other things that are happening right at the same time, like right around the time now where Gen Z is in school or graduating from school. The pandemic happened, and I know that's affected more than Gen Z. It's affected everyone, but it's especially difficult for that to be aligning with the time in your life that feels so important and life-changing. For that to be happening right around the time of a pandemic is just so shitty timing. It almost feels like a sick joke that Gen Z is having to deal with this, as well as having to deal with, at the same time, I remember like in the beginning of 2020, there were those fires in Australia, and there has been a lot of flooding recently. These are not the normal amount and normal level of intensity of natural disasters, We are now beginning, as we become adults and start our lives, to witness and experience, depending on where you live, the unfortunate effects of climate change that have been ignored for years by previous generations who didn't want to do anything about it because it would disrupt the profits of certain industries. And now, as those people grow much, much older and won't have to deal with it for very long, Gen Z is starting their lives and trying to have hope for the future. And what do they see when they open their door with their college graduation caps and gowns is a pandemic and natural disasters as a result of climate change. I want to say that previous generations had ways of coping with their own struggles. I know that they had difficulties and worries as well that just weren't quite the same as what Gen Z is going through, but a lot of those ways that they dealt with it are no longer being used by Gen Z. And one of those things is family. A lot of people, I think older people, have definitely said that, whatever's going around in the world at large, at least I have my family, and being able to not see the bigger picture and just focus on your immediate family and the people that are very close to you, who you love, whoever you've married, and your children. Children definitely are life-changing, and a lot of people have had them to be happy and to share their love with someone. Gen Z is having, and millennials, the trend of having kids is definitely going down. And I have an entire video about why Gen Z and millennials don't want kids, so I'll just link that in the description. But using kids as a way to feel more happy and love and hope about the future is not really a mechanism that Gen Z is going towards, understandably. And another thing that is a downward trend over the years that maybe parents and grandparents used to try and distract themselves from their stressors and worries of the world was religion. And rates of religion are decreasing over time, with millennials and Gen Z being the least religious generations that have ever been so far. And I think a lot of that is due to compounding science and knowledge. And despite what anyone says, religion and science, it's difficult for those two to peacefully coexist. They can up to a certain point, but I think we're passing that point, and young people are having a hard time believing in religious views as a way to feel happy or feel hopeful and have love for the world. So those things as ways to deal with how they've been fucked over are not really good ways anymore, and you have to find new ways. And this feels like a really sad way to end the video, but I wish I had some wisdom. But honestly, I am like a young millennial / old Gen Z, so even I don't know all the ways to fix these problems and how to deal with this deck that has been shuffled against us. It's really been difficult, and I hope that maybe things can turn around, but I guess we'll just have to see. If you're Gen Z, let me know if you feel any of these things I talked about in this video have described you and you've had to deal with them. And if you're a boomer who thinks that Gen Z is all faking their depression and that climate change is a hoax, I invite you to leave. And thanks for watching this video.